Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy here at Zimperium. I would like to welcome you to yet another one of our webinars, and this one we're going to have a little bit of fun with, despite a relatively serious topic. So before we dive in, a few things, usual perfunctory things. Probably take 20-25 minutes. If you have any questions at the end, then we will I'll field those questions. If not, then we will give you some time back. We don't like to create questions just for the sake of creating them and making ourselves look good. So some people do that. We don't. There will be a copy of the report sent to everybody that's on the webinar. And an archived version will be up on the site if you want to come back or share it with anybody else as we get into it. Please use the Q&A section, even if you have questions about technical stuff. We don't use the chat session capabilities, and to make sure that my esteemed colleagues in communications feel good about this, please make sure that you follow us on all social media. It actually is a very great way to stay on top of all things having to do with mobile security, because that's what we do. We eat, sleep, and breathe mobile security from a 360 standpoint, whether it's on devices or whether it's on apps. That's just what we happen to do. So, first of all, happy Valentine's Day to everybody. I hope you guys have a really nice date, all the rest of that kind of fun stuff. Hopefully, if you do have any dates, it's not a flibbergibbet, and you'll be able to actually enjoy your time. On my part, since I actually am not dating anybody, I suppose I could use some of these dating apps, but even though I'm not dating at this point in time, I will not resile from sharing all of this information with you on what are the security and privacy risks found in these popular apps. So what exactly are we diving into in the spirit of Valentine's Day? Well, first of all, we thought it'd be kind of fun with Valentine's Day being on February 14th for us to look at 14 of the top dating apps around the world. The reality is we're looking at 28 of them because 14 iOS, 14 Android, but we still thought it'd be fun anyway. So we took the top 14. We've anonymized all the data here because, as you'll see, there are security and privacy risks in every app. And if somebody, i.e. a bad person, bad guy, knows what these vulnerabilities and what these risks are, then they would be able to capitalize on them. So we're sharing this in an anonymized fashion. If you happen to be a dating app provider, then feel free. We're trying to reach out. We've been trying to reach out to the various different folks to share the findings directly. This is a summary set of information. We have a solution called Z3A, that stands for Advanced App Analysis, which actually can take apps in and break them down and talk about all the security and compliance risks that are in those apps. So the scores and everything we're talking about are generated directly out of that engine. As a general rule, well, not a general rule, facts, with the exception of OWASP, which I'll talk about here in a second, higher numbers are worse than lower numbers. So you see the examples over here. Generally speaking, in our system, a 35 and below is passing. That means you have very few security risks, et cetera. Whereas an 75 and higher is straight up failing, and the rest are in between. So that's what this has to do with. Our Z Labs, the best mobile security researchers on the planet, give every app a passing, average, or failing grade from a privacy and security standpoint. So for each one of the apps, there are 3 categories we're reporting on that I've been kind of glossing over as you just went through this. First one is the OWASP, and OWASP has been around for quite some time. It's an open web standard originally. They have best practices of how to do testing of web-based apps. They've extended that a few years back into the OWASP Mobile Top 10. And if you are interested in even a deeper dive in the OWASP Top 10, you can check our archived webinars from last, I think it was December, where we actually hung out with a gent from OWASP. And we went through the mobile top 10 specifically. So we report on how did each one of these apps do against the OWASP top 10. We also come back and talk about privacy risks. These are things that lead to potential data leakage, obviously, especially with things like GDPR and CCPA in California. This is a very important side of things. And then we also come back and talk about straight security risks that are in these. And obviously security risks, anything having to do with being able to leverage the app to have certain capabilities, including potentially getting credit card information and the like. So with that being said, let's start with the OWASP. As I mentioned, there's the mobile top 10, and I won't go through reading every single one of these, but you can basically see that here's the top 10, and it covers everything from storage to communication, authentication. Is it potentially reverse engineerable? Or is there opportunities for code tampering? All these different things factor into ways that can lead to both security and privacy risks. So we like to use it because it's a good standard that's across the board. So how did our apps do against the OWASP top 10? Well, when we look at all 28 of them combined, 96% were vulnerable to reverse engineering. So obviously, reverse engineering can lead to a whole bunch of different things, including imposter apps and things on those lines. If they're vulnerable to reverse engineering, that makes it that much easier for a bad guy to capitalize on them. Almost the same amount, 9 out of 10, don't secure communication of sensitive data properly. We'll dive into this a little bit. 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5, don't store it properly. And 50% are vulnerable to code tampering. So that's when we look at both combined, but it's always really interesting to kind of dive into what are the similarities and what are the differences by operating system. So here's the iOS view. And we like to use these charts here with just, the sliding green and red, because it very clearly and very visually points out. And you can see 100% failed 4 tests. There was 100% that passed 3 or 4, was that 3 tests, I guess, as well? But 100% failed the 4 tests. Didn't store the data properly. And in these Z3 reports, each one of them failed in a different way. So when you actually get into the individual reports of the individual apps, it explains maybe app 1 stored it in a certain way that provided access to all the other apps that are on device, whereas app 2, we're putting it on servers with poor reputations, for instance. So there's different reasons that they did, but 100% did not store data correctly, 100% had issues with communication, 100% code tampering, and 100%, as I was talking about, susceptible to reverse engineering. We had a couple that had code quality issues and poor cryptography, but you can see for iOS, the main problems are storage, communication, code tampering, and reverse engineering. When we shift over to Android, you see that the 3, storage, communication, and reverse engineering, are all very consistent. But what's interesting is none of them failed code tampering. And what's interesting for us, a lot of times we get into these, we've done this with shopping, traveling, we have another banking one coming up. A lot of times teams will have totally different teams, and sometimes some in-source, some outsourced for iOS versus Android. Part of our value in showing this to people is a lot of times you just don't even know what you don't know because you're in such a hurry, right? The other thing that I personally believe, and this was a conversation I had with Sean from OWASP back in 2019, tail end of 2019, a major part of why we like to share this information is we think that there's a big gap in knowledge of people even knowing about the best practices from OWASP. So that's one of the reasons that we like to share them. And then, as I said, when you combine the two together, this is where we get the information I shared on the slide at the very beginning, where you see that clearly still the reverse engineering is the biggest threat, followed by the communication, storage, and then code tampering, completely driven by iOS. So what's interesting about the OWASP is this overall set of best practices that actually starts to set the tone for for the privacy and security when you actually dive into it. So kind of a little bit of an overlap, whereas privacy and security are, the next two big buckets. 100% of iOS apps and 71% of Android apps failed to receive a passing grade. And again, remember from our scale, a 35 and below was a passing grade. So basically 100% and 71% failed to receive a passing grade. So pretty serious in terms of ramifications, especially when you consider some of the PII that's associated with dating apps. Personal information. So in the report itself, when you get it, again, we're not going through every single level, there's a summary. And here's the summary. And again, 35 and below is passing, 75 and above is straight up failing, right? So the average for both, you can see it's 69 and 41. The highest score, and I'm going to talk about the two high scores for each of these in privacy and security, what sort of risks are in here. The highest score from an iOS standpoint is almost perfectly bad. I mean, 100 is the upper end of the scale, right? Conversely, we actually had a couple or one or two, I can't remember, that had a 5 from a score, which is really, really good from an Android standpoint. So the app that had a 98, what were some of the risks that were in there, which will help us just kind of set the tone for some of these? Here's some of the things. Full screenshot of the UI. Well, why do you need to take a screenshot of the UI? Completely monitoring the iOS pasteboard. What does that have to do with a dating app, right? Frameworks, depends on the framework. So when you dive into the specifics, there are some frameworks that are notorious for data leakage, right? Can view and import saved photos and videos. Now that one's kind of interesting because I can actually see where for a dating app, that's relevant, right? How it's implemented is the issue. And so that's a piece. And then some of these things like, why does it need my MAC address? Why is it sending SMS messages quite often without my knowledge? These are just some examples. The Android high score of 64, which again is an average score, it's not totally failing, but it's also not passing. One of the examples is using that insecure content provider, right? Exported components is another thing that you have to worry about, where it's literally exporting components, and those components can lead, obviously, to data leakage. Last known GPS coordinates. Now, maybe there's a capability in the app that is like, hey, I'm getting ready for a date and I want to know where you are right now. But as a general rule, that's not something that an app needs to have. Again, SMS and RSS, and then Crashlytics SDK is, again, one of those notorious things where Crashlytics by itself is fine, but the hackers know how to capitalize on it in order to collect PII. So here's the summary view when you actually kind of look at it. And you can see that there's 4 iOS apps that are straight up in the failing category, right? But you can also see that collectively in the Android, there's 4 that got a straight up passing grade, which is pretty impressive. When you put them together, there's only one overall dating app that gets a passing grade from a privacy standpoint. For each one of these things, we talk about critical issues and dangerous issues, and I'm not going to spend time talking about the dangerous issues in this. They're itemized in the report itself, which you can pull through. Critical ones are ones that, from a privacy standpoint, are ones that you have to address immediately, either because there's imminent danger of leakage, or there's some things where people are doing things that you're going to get kicked out of the App Store or the Play Store if Apple catches it, which is amazing because these are the 14 of the leading apps, dating apps around the world, right? Dangerous ones are ones like the ad networks and potential data abuse elements, which are not necessarily imminent. They're not quite as critical, but you still need to know about them. And then basically what ends up happening with every one of our customers who actually takes these reports and does some stuff with it, scanning their own internal apps, it's always just like every other part of security, it's a risk-reward analysis. They will say, based on their own particular view, which critical and which dangerous issues need to get corrected now We would argue all the critical ones do, but some of the dangerous ones, you might say, it's worth the risk for this release, but we're going to get it in the next release. So you build it into your next process. So the critical iOS issues from a privacy standpoint, 100% of these guys log information into the system console, and those logs are accessible to any app. So if you're logging information into the system console, any other app can pull that data, including any malicious app. Clearly a privacy issue. I was talking about screenshots of the full UI, right? Well, if you're taking screenshots of the full UI, you're giving so much information to a potential hacker in terms of what apps are installed on there, potentially what credentials are being put out, user IDs, all of that stuff can be accessible. And then the iOS pasteboard, which again, somebody might say, okay, I'm going to paste my password and then I'm going to put it in over here. Well, if you've got access to the pasteboard, and this is one of those things where I keep kind of going, okay, what would be the use case of actively monitoring the iOS pasteboard if you're a dating app? And I can't really come up with one. What I do know is if you're doing it, and then for instance, if you're logging everything to the system console, you're exposing this information to anybody. So there's only one critical privacy issue for Android, but almost every app had it. You can see that 12 of the 14 were using insecure content providers. Similar to what I was talking about with the system log on the iOS piece, even though this is up in the cloud, other applications can request and access the same data because of the insecure content provider and how it's being put up there. So again, direct access to privacy. When you look at it just visually, these are the same three from the iOS and the one from the Android side that shows what the critical risks are. And as I mentioned, in the report, we've got detailed analysis, just like I ran through on the critical ones, and charts for the most dangerous ones as well, in terms of percentages across the board. So shifting over and pivoting to security from, at this point in time, 100% again of iOS apps failed to receive a passing security grade, and now 9 out of 10 Android apps did. Now what's interesting is when you actually get into the report, and you'll see this, and you're going to get it visually here in a quick second, even though it's like, oh, so iOS apps are less secure than Android. No. The reality is 100% of them failed to receive a passing grade, but the percentage of actual issues on Android is significantly higher in these apps than on iOS. So at the highest level, when you dive into the data, I know it sounds kind of funny. Hey, at the high level, when you dive deep, iOS apps are exposed more privacy risks in terms of the dating apps, and the Android ones expose greater security risks. So again, it's really interesting that there's this combination of, okay, it's the same. And I'm going to show you one, like our one poster child for you got to get your stuff together, that actually failed outright both security and privacy. But as a general rule, like we showed with the one, they got a 5 on privacy. We got like a 60 on the iOS side and a 5 on Android. Totally different, right? So here's, again, 35 below, passing, and 75 and above, failing, okay? You can see that the interesting thing is, from a security standpoint, across the board, the average, they're identical. But you look at the high score, again, outlier though, as a relative when you get into it. There's one app that really set the bar on iOS, but the Android one was very close. Remember, on the privacy one, the Android one was still in the average category. But then interestingly, again, there are still some Android apps that received passing grades for security. The iOS app that had 93, the one that was off the charts at the chart that I just showed you, right? They have an authentication method, stumbling over big words all of a sudden, that can literally override SSL or TLS, virtually making the communication, wide open, right? They implement swizzling API calls, which by themselves might not be bad, but there's lots of cases where swizzling API calls have been capitalized on by malicious apps. Again, more insecure communication, another variation of swizzling. This has to do with the jailbreak method that we've detected. They're vulnerable to SQL injection. SQL injection, used to be the domain strictly of websites. And then there's some additional compiled libraries embedded in the app, which may or may not be risky. We don't know because they're compiled, but they're not part of the overall stack. It's just additional compiled libraries. But you see that a primary thrust of the security failings of this iOS app, one could argue, could almost be on the privacy side, because a lot of it has to do with unencrypted communications, right? But we just happen to put them over on the security side because there's ramifications over there. The Android app that had the 81 has a whole bunch of different things, a large part of which have to do with Java and JavaScript, and some potential abilities to be able to inject objects into these things that clearly people aren't looking for. There's also some things having to do with being able to execute commands at the OS level. And by being able to do that, it exposes itself significantly more than others. Pulling apps and files from remote locations clearly sets up the opportunity to inject or fake the app into pulling apps from your remote location as a bad guy instead of the legitimate one. A little bit more on the web side, or the encryption side, the network encryption side, than the iOS app, but it hasn't been the primary thing. So when you kind of look at the Apple app, a large part of it had to do with communication issues and encryption issues. If you come over here, a lot of it has to do with injection and the ability to pull apps from remote locations, which to a certain extent is a variation of injection, right? So here's the snapshot when you look at it. You can see that there's still 4 iOS apps that fail, right? And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Android apps that fail. So it's interesting that the average still ends up at the 61, but there are some poster children. Now, I mentioned that there was the iOS app with the 93 and the Android app with an 81. You guys can see that dating app provider number 1, we definitely need to talk to because that is a poster child. Now you go down to number 3, you see that they also failed. You look at number 14, they failed both. So there's some work to be done here. So what are the critical security issues on iOS? I mentioned that you're going to get a visual here of the fact that there are, in fact, more critical issues on Android than there is on iOS, right? Some of these I've already been hitting when I was talking about the 93 app just a minute ago, right? So the authentication of SSL, the swizzling APIs, the swizzling jailbreaks. You can see that the poster child, the 91, had all of the first ones, right? But then there's a couple down at the one that's additional is the ability to implement over-the-air installation. So I mentioned that as a general rule, that Android app, again, dating provider number 1, was more likely to be capitalized on with injection, whereas the iOS app had more to do with the encryption piece. This is a variation of that injection sort of thing, or that ability to implement files from someplace else. If you can do over-the-air installation, that's completely around the Apple review process. So obviously Apple with the vetting in the App Store is a strength of Apple's. But if you can do things like over-the-air installation, then you get around that. Again, you sit there and go, okay, why are we doing that in a dating app? But the only thing I know is if I'm a bad guy and I know your dating app can do that, I can capitalize on that. And that's what I probably would do. On Android, I know you're thinking, wait, I thought he said that there was more issues on Android, critical issues on Android than there is on iOS. Why is there a shorter list? It's because it's on 2 pages, so you can actually read some of it as we actually go through this. We talked about the injection piece. We talked about the ability to execute commands at the OS level, but also 50% can actually create brand new subprocesses at the OS level. 43% have a version of the Facebook SDK that's been vulnerable to hijacking for quite some time. And then we talked about the WebKit download file from the internet, again, part of the injection side of things. The insecure, we talked about that. Ability to pull in files, we talked about that. Loading compiled code in APK and jar files, including ones that are external storage. It's a variation of the theme again. I'm loading this compiled code. We can't really analyze a large part of that compiled code. Oh, by the way, you can pull it in from external storage. Well, if I can pull it in from external storage, I can actually pull it from your storage instead of mine if I can trick it, right? And then there's some other capabilities there as well. So when you look at it, here's clearly the top two have to do with network versions of things, network threats. When you look at Android critical issues, it's a little bit more fluid, a little bit more granular. I mean, across the board, there's more that has to do with it. But you look at the top two, they have to do with injections in JavaScript. You look down at the next two have to do with OS levels and processes. Then you get into the vulnerable Facebook SDK, which is like it's been vulnerable for quite some time. We should probably do something about that. And it kind of goes down from there. So what do people do next? Because I promised I would do this in 25 minutes, and it's 27 minutes. If you are a dating app provider, and frankly, even if you're not a dating app provider, if you are an app provider of any way, shape, or form, contact us, and we can actually give you the full detailed reports. I mentioned that this is a summary of the data for each one of these. The typical Z3A report that we've got from a technical standpoint is 70 pages long. So the level of detail that you can have of what sort of information do we have is really, really, really useful. One of my favorite things to think of, the Hawthorne effect. Philip Hawthorne was a genius, apparently, that self-proclaimed for the Industrial Revolution back at the turn of the century. Every place Philip Hawthorne went, productivity doubled in a month. And everybody's like, wow, how did he do that? This guy's a genius. How does he do it? Ultimately, they figured out he did one thing that contributed to that increase. He turned up the lights. As soon as he turned up the lights in the factory, all of a sudden the workers were like, I guess I better pay attention because I know the boss can see me, and he doubled productivity. Turning up the lights and having a Hawthorne effect is a key thrust of these Z3A reports. You want to be able to see what's in there. Then, based on your own policies and your own compliance, you can decide which ones need to get capitalized on. But if you are a dating app provider, in the report, you'll see that we have these appendices which actually by app go through and show you how you scored against the OWASP and the privacy and security scores for both Android and iOS. We are reaching out to as many of the dating app companies as we can because in our mind, this is responsible disclosure. We understand, that's why it's anonymous right now. We understand that by providing this information with the dating app providers' names, it would provide a blueprint for bad guys to capitalize on you. So we are trying to reach out to you, but if you are already a dating app provider, please contact us and we will actually sit down with that report, run it through with you and see what recommendations we'd have to fix it. So with that, I would just like to thank everybody for your time, and I'm going to stop and see if we have any questions. Okay, I don't see any questions. I wish everybody a very happy Valentine's Day. Don't forget to buy everybody a gift. I guess that's one of the things you're supposed to do so you don't get in too much trouble. And thank you very much for your time, and look for the report.